She had no idea that a mundane life could hide so many secrets. Subscribe and write in the comments what you would do in her place. My name is Sarah, and my life had always seemed quiet and predictable. We lived together with my mom and stepfather, and everything felt normal: work, dinners, family conversations. But gradually, I began to notice little things that were both unsettling and intriguing. His gaze lingered longer than it should have. His words sounded softer than simple care, and the silence between us became too charged. Every morning he was the first to wake up, made coffee, and left a cup of tea for me on the table. I thought it was just a habit until I caught his gaze, full of strange attention. In the evenings, we often found ourselves alone in the kitchen. I'd be washing the dishes and he would dry them. It seemed like nothing unusual, yet every accidental touch of our hands left a mark on me that made my heart beat faster. And the more time passed, the more I realized that behind these everyday moments, something more significant was hidden. Something we both kept silent about but felt every day. I tried to act calmly as if nothing was happening, but with each passing day my feelings grew stronger. We would sit at dinner, the three of us, Mom, him, and me. But as soon as Mom left the room for a minute, the silence between us became overwhelming. He wouldn't say a word. He would just look. And in that look, there was too much for me to pretend I didn't notice anything. One evening, I stayed behind in the kitchen, tidying up. Mom had already gone to bed. I turned on the faucet, and at that very moment he walked in. Slowly, as if he had been waiting for me. We stood side by side. I washed, and he took a towel and started drying the plates. It seemed like a simple scene, but the air became heavy. Our hands brushed against each other, and I felt a shiver run down my skin. I looked up and met his gaze, long, calm, but too intense. In that moment, I understood that we both knew this accident hadn't been an accident for a long time. I quickly lowered my eyes, trying to focus on the water and the dishes, but my hands were trembling. He continued to stand beside me, silently drying the dishes. And in that silence, I could hear his every breath. It seemed even the sound of the water couldn't drown out the tension that was growing between us. When I finished, he took the last plate from my hands. Our fingers touched again. I flinched, but he didn't pull his hand away immediately. The light touch lasted for just a second, but inside me, everything flipped upside down. "It's late," he said quietly, as if nothing had happened. I nodded, wiping my hands on the towel, and headed for the door. But halfway there I stopped. I felt his gaze on my back. Heavy, persistent. I didn't turn around, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something that both scared and strangely attracted me. In my room, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. I tossed and turned, listening to every rustle in the apartment. The silence felt too loud, and the walls seemed to hold the tension left over from that evening. I picked up a book to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to his gaze, too direct, too intense. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but my heart once again began to beat faster. A growing tension. I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were unhurried, confident. He stopped at my door. A few seconds passed. Silence. I lay there, holding my breath, afraid to even move. Then the footsteps continued, moving away, and everything became quiet again. But those seconds by my door were louder to me than any words. I realized that a return to simple, everyday scenes was no longer possible. A thin, almost invisible line had appeared between us, a line that one of us would cross sooner or later. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I sat at the table, poured myself some tea, and looked at my phone, pretending to be absorbed in the news. But the moment he walked into the kitchen, the air changed again. He came in calmly, with his usual expression, but I knew he remembered the silence by my door too. He placed a plate of toast in front of me, as if it were the most ordinary morning. "Eat," he said simply. but in his voice there was something softer than simple care. I thanked him and lowered my eyes to my mug, but the feeling of his gaze didn't leave me. It was as if he was studying my every reaction. We ate in silence, but this silence wasn't empty. It stretched between us like a thin thread, constantly reminding us that now we both knew a little more than we should. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I felt it, but that I was starting to want these glances and this silence. The day stretched on as usual: work, chores, and short conversations with Mom. But somewhere inside, I was constantly waiting for the moment when I would be alone with him again. And when Mom left for a neighbor's house in the evening, the silence in the apartment returned, that same thick, tense silence. I sat in the living room with my laptop on my knees, pretending to be busy. He walked in and stopped nearby, as if choosing where to sit. He finally settled into an armchair opposite me, and a gaze hung between us that made me lose my train of thought and forget what I was reading on the screen. "Are you tired?" His voice was calm, but it was too close to a tone that held more than just concern. "No," I replied, trying not to meet his eyes, but I looked up anyway and instantly regretted it. His eyes held the same tension that I carried within me, unspoken but too obvious. I realized we were both walking a fine line, and each new evening made it more fragile. I closed my laptop, as if that would help me hide from my own thoughts. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees and not taking his eyes off me. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, and every sound felt too loud. A point of no return. I stood up, deciding to go to my room, but he suddenly got up too. We were close to each other in the narrow hallway, and the distance between us shrank to just a few steps. I felt the warmth of his shoulder and held my breath. "You should get some rest," I said quietly, but my voice had a tremor in it that sent shivers down my spine. I nodded, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. We were standing too close, and this pause, this silence between our words, felt louder than any confession. In that moment, I knew normal life was no longer possible. Everything had changed, and we both knew it. I took a step to the side to pass, but he didn't move, and for a fraction of a second, our shoulders brushed. That light touch was enough to turn everything inside me upside down. I almost ran to my room, closed the door behind me, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed he could hear it even through the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, but instead of finding peace, I saw his eyes, intense, serious, and too close. I lay on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I replayed the scene in my head over and over again. His voice, the way he looked at me. It felt as if the apartment itself held our silent tension, and the walls had become witnesses to something no one should know. And the more I tried to escape these thoughts, the more I understood that he felt it too. And now it was only a matter of time. The next day, everything seemed as if nothing had happened. Morning, the usual breakfast, Mom's questions, his calm answers. But beneath this normal rhythm, something else was hiding. Something almost tangible, like a subtle current in the air. I tried to avoid his gaze, but I still found myself noticing every little detail about him. How he adjusted his shirt, how he held his mug, how he moved so easily and confidently around the kitchen. These small things seemed to engrave themselves in my memory more deeply than any words. In the evening, Mom was late and we were alone again. I turned on the TV to fill the silence, but the screen's noise didn't help. He sat down next to me, not too close but not at our usual distance either. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly, not taking his eyes off me. "Yes," I replied, but my voice came out softer than I intended. And in that moment, I realized that the simplest questions were becoming dangerous because they hid everything we weren't saying. I grabbed the remote and frantically started flipping through channels just to avoid looking at his eyes. But he didn't look away, and that made it even harder to breathe. It felt like the room was shrinking, and only this tension, which was impossible to break, remained between us. At one point, I felt his hand lightly touch the back of the couch behind me. The movement was natural, casual, but I knew it wasn't an accident. I froze, not daring to move. The sound of the TV seemed to dissolve, and I could only hear my own heart. He leaned in a little closer, just a little, and quietly said, "You've changed." The words hung in the air, and I couldn't find a response. I stared straight ahead, but inside everything was turning upside down because we both understood. We were no longer pretending to be indifferent. I slowly turned my head and our eyes met. There was no game, no pretense in his eyes. Only a quiet confidence and that very feeling I had been trying to deny. The second felt like an eternity. I bit my lip to stop myself from saying anything and clasped my hands, hiding them under the blanket. But he noticed my reaction, and the corners of his lips twitched, as if he understood more than I wanted to show. The silence was so thick that it felt like any sound would shatter it like glass. I stood up abruptly, trying to escape his gaze, but he also rose. We were too close. His shoulder barely brushed mine, and that simple touch made my head spin. "You should go to sleep," he said quietly, and his voice wasn't a suggestion but something else, something that made shivers run down my skin. The beginning of something new. I nodded, not daring to meet his eyes, and headed for the door. But my back felt like it was on fire from him still watching me. In my room, I paced back and forth for a long time without turning on the light. My nerves were strung tight like guitar strings and I couldn't calm down. I listened. There were no footsteps in the hallway. Everything was quiet except for the night sounds outside the window. But the feeling of his gaze, his closeness, wouldn't leave me. I sat on the bed, hugging my knees and closed my eyes, but the scene came back to me again and again. How he looked, how his words sounded too quiet and too serious. I wanted to convince myself it was just tiredness, my imagination playing tricks, but my heart didn't believe it. The minutes stretched on endlessly, and suddenly, a faint creak of the floorboards in the hallway. Someone walked past my door without stopping. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. The silence returned, but now it was different, filled with tension and unspoken thoughts. I realized that simple, peaceful sleep was no longer possible. Each new day would remind me that we had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. The next morning started too normally. The smell of coffee in the kitchen, quiet footsteps, the sound of dishes. But it was this familiar simplicity that now seemed unreal, as if we were both playing roles we had assigned ourselves. I walked into the kitchen. He was already sitting at the table, reading the news on his phone. He looked as calm and familiar as ever. But when he looked up, time seemed to stop. His gaze was the same, a little longer, a little deeper than it should be. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound normal. I sat down across from him and poured myself some tea. We were silent, but this silence was full. I heard him put down his spoon, put down his mug, and each sound resonated within me more strongly than loud music. And then he said, almost casually, "You look different today." The words were simple, but they sounded as if he had said so much more. I felt my cheeks flush, and in that moment, I understood that even the most ordinary phrases could no longer be just words. I looked away at my mug, as if the tea had suddenly become incredibly interesting. But inside, everything was already churning, and I knew he had noticed. His calm was deceptive. Behind it was the same tension that was in me. He stood up and went to the cupboard for bread. As he passed me, he lightly touched my back with his hand, as if by accident, but I felt it too acutely. My legs turned to jelly, and my heart jumped into my throat. I sat motionless, as if I was afraid any movement would give me away. "You're not eating enough," he said in a casual tone, returning to his seat. "You need to take care of yourself." I nodded, but what I heard wasn't his words, but the way he said them, softly with a hidden warmth. We fell silent again, but now the pause felt almost tangible, as if a question hung in the air between us, one that would have to be asked sooner or later. I found myself waiting for that moment, even though I was trembling with fear. I took a piece of bread to keep my hands busy, but my fingers were trembling, and it was impossible to hide. He noticed. I saw it in the slight shadow of a smile on his face. Not mockery, no, but more like understanding. I felt it was getting hard to breathe and put the plate down. "Thanks, I'll finish it later," I said quietly and got up from the table. He didn't try to stop me or say a word, but as I walked past, his gaze burned into me so intensely that everything inside me flipped over. It felt like one more step, and the invisible line between us would disappear. I closed myself in my room and leaned my forehead against the door. My heart was pounding and my head was spinning. An ordinary breakfast had turned into a trial, simple words into hints, and accidental gestures into a confession. And the harder I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, the clearer it became. He felt it too. And that thought of tomorrow frightened and attracted me at the same time. I lay on the bed trying to calm down, but every minute stretched on forever. My mind was filled with fragments. His words, his gaze, that almost weightless touch on my back. I squeezed my eyes shut, but instead of peace, a strange excitement grew inside me, one that was impossible to get rid of. In the evening, Mom came home late, tired, and quickly went to bed. I stayed in my room pretending to be busy with a book, but every movement outside the door resonated too strongly within me. Footsteps. The sound of water in the kitchen. The quiet creak of an armchair in the living room. He was nearby, and that knowledge seemed to draw me in. I walked into the hallway to get a glass of water. A strip of light from the living room fell onto the floor, and I involuntarily stopped. He was sitting in the armchair with a book on his knees, looking directly at me. In his eyes there was no question or smile, only a calm and silence that spoke much louder than words. I froze in the doorway, unable to look away. It was as if the whole house had disappeared, and only the two of us were left, along with this unspoken feeling that there was no escaping. That night everything changed. The silence, the glances, and the accidental touches were no longer secrets. They became a revelation. A special night happened between us, one that only the two of us knew about. A night after which it was impossible to go back to our old lives.